want to welcome to the show Professor Jonathan Boston, who is the chair of the School of Government, Victoria University. Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Pat. I have a chair, but I'm not the chair.
Okay, I was going to say, we often talk to professors and academics and teachers.
Yes.
And what is your role within the school as chair?
So I'm now an emeritus professor, Pat. So I retired from full-time work at the beginning of last year. I'm on a part-time fixed-term contract.
So you get in and help them sort things out when they need it, because you're the guy who knew everything from last year, that sort of thing, the fixer.
Well, sometimes.
Hey, thank you so much for joining us. I very much wanted to talk to you because you've been in the press in the last few days talking about, I don't know whether we call it ACT policy or David Seymour's policy or just the policy or the idea about reducing the number of public servants by 15,000 people. And you've been voicing some concerns about that. Maybe you could start off by just giving us a bit of a synopsis of what are your concerns about the idea of dramatically reducing the number of public servants?
So the first thing for people to recognize is that when we talk about the public sector, in the broad sense, we're talking around about 400,000 people that work for the central government. And within that, there are approximately 60,000 who work for what's sometimes called the core public sector or the public service. And that consists of about 40 government departments, departmental agencies, interdepartmental executive boards, and so on. So it's this smaller part of the total public sector that has been the subject of some discussion in recent days. The ACT Party, for example, has proposed that public service should be cut back to its levels in 2017, which was around 47,000 employees on a full-time equivalent basis. The National Party has suggested there should be a cut of around 600 million in the 6 billion or so that's currently spent on the core public sector. So that's actually about 10%, not allowing for inflation. So both those numbers are pretty big. Now, what people need to think about is this. First of all, what's magical about 47,000? Well, there's nothing. We can shift people in and out of the core public sector by changing the nature of the organizations for which they work. So, for example, there are currently 9,000 people who work for corrections. That's a government department. They run prisons. Well, prisons could be run by a Crown entity in the way that our health system is. That would shift, probably 8,000 people at least out of the core public sector and put them in the wider public sector. Well, would that achieve anything? Probably not much, but it would certainly reduce the numbers in the core public sector. So key point, first of all, is focusing on an arbitrary number of people who work in a particular part of the public sector, in my view, has little merit. The next thing we have to think about is,
just on that, I think, and I don't know how you can address this, so I'll just say it. The merit in that is for a political party can say, this government has been ridiculous. They didn't need to do what they did. We're going to go back to what it was before. That was better. That's their merit in it, not that they're saying it as bluntly as I am. What you're saying is there's no merit in the outcomes they tell us about. But theirs is a political narrative saying that Labour bad, national better before Labour, let's go back to national. That's what it feels like to me.
Sure. And there's also the narrative that smaller is beautiful. Well, it isn't necessarily beautiful. If we went back, say, 12, 13 years ago, we had only 2 mining inspectors working for the Department of Labour. And the Commission of Inquiry into the Pike River mine disaster highlighted that that was totally inadequate. And if there had been more people working to oversee the regulation of the mining industry in the country, we may well not have lost 30 people.
Yeah, so that's fascinating, Jonathan. We often give the argument about big and small government. Not that's a great argument. I'll remember that one or that example. But we often say the Gulf of Mexico, the BP oil rig that went up, they had one oil inspector in that region. Sure. And so that would have been an incident where, or a time where more government, bigger government would have been better, i.e. more inspectors. Our bed bag, what do you say? What's that word? Anyway, what we try and get out there quite a lot. Benchmark will do, is the argument of smaller government is almost as stupid as the argument that bigger government is better. What we want is better government, better
Absolutely.
government is
And
better.
I'm not in favor of big government for the sake of big government. Absolutely not. We want a public sector that fulfills the objectives that it's there to fulfill as efficiently, effectively, as honestly, and so on as it can. But there's no sort of one right number of people, or indeed
100%.
one right number of dollars. Now, just very quickly, in terms of 47,000, many people at that time within the public sector thought that the public sector was starved of capability and capacity at the time, which is one of the reasons why it has expanded since. Secondly, there's been a 10% increase in the country's population. We've gone from 4.8 million to 5.2 million, rising rapidly. In those sorts of circumstances, you would expect, other things being equal, for the public sector, and indeed the public service, the smaller part, to expand somewhat as well. Now, it's obviously expanded, in the case of the public service, more than 10% in the last 6 years. But I, for one, wouldn't want to suggest some, quote, right number.
Yeah. And also, what's happened in the last 3 years that might have caused those services to expand? A little thing called COVID. There's been cyclones. There's been all sorts of things that might... Yes. I'm sure public service in 1939 was a lot less than what it was in 1945 for some little things that were happening around the world.
Absolutely. And that's one of the points I've made in some of the interviews I've been doing, which is that we need a public service that's going to be capable of managing the kinds of challenges and risks that we face now, not those that we face, say, in 2017, but what we face now and what are coming at us from the future. And gosh, we've got no shortage of really big challenges, massive, technological changes happening and on the horizon, massive geopolitical changes internationally, massive changes on the horizon in terms of demography, and of course all the huge ecological challenges. So, as citizens, certainly speaking now as a citizen, I want a public service that can protect the public interest and do a good job, not right just now, but that's important, but also for the future in terms of what challenges we're going to have to meet.
It sounds like what you're saying, correct me if I'm wrong, is that they've picked an arbitrary figure of 15,000 people or 47,000 total, which means nothing. And I get the sense that you would say something like, if it was fair, let's assess how many we need and then start at that point, rather than just picking the arbitrary figure of 47,000. Because, maybe there would be some out of the health system that would be okay to move on because COVID's tailing down. But just to pick that arbitrary number sounds like that's one of your concerns. Why that arbitrary number?
Absolutely. If we want to do this in a rational way, we have to decide what it is that we want the public sector to do.
Yeah.
And then what sort of resources it's going to need, what kind of capability it's going to need in order to fulfill those objectives. And then you can get down to the nitty gritty of, well, just how many people actually do you need to employ or contract with or buy services from the private sector from in order to achieve the objectives you want to achieve. So just plucking a number out of the atmosphere or out of the, out of the past is not a rational way, in my view, of deciding how to govern well.
What I hear you saying is a little bit like I just said, better government is better. We want better government, not necessarily bigger, not necessarily smaller, just better.
Yes.
Yes. What I'd like to do is play for you some audio now, because David Seymour himself was asked on a radio show this morning if your concerns, so what your concerns are, which is why I asked you about your concerns first of all, had any legitimacy. And this is what David Seymour, this is how he answered. This is 90 seconds for us to listen to.
No, I don't. Just not to be a know-it-all, but it's actually about 28-29% increase in the core public service. It's really important just to differentiate. We're not talking about cops. We're not talking about teachers or nurses or doctors or corrections officers or anyone other than people that work in core agencies. So you look at MB, Ministry of Business, Innovation, Employment, gone up from about 3,500 to 5,800, another 2,300 people working in there. But if you talk to anyone who's actually trying to run a business, you say, gee, has your life got easier? Has it got easier to run a business? Because, you've had about a 2/3 increase in the number of MB bureaucrats. No. Ministry of Education, 2,500 when Labor came in. Now about 4,400, nearly doubled in size. The Ministry of Education, every principal I talk to, and in the Epsom electorate, I try and meet every principal every year. about 30 of them, and they never tell me that life's getting easier because the Ministry of Education's expanded. So, he's just wrong if he thinks that we need all of these extra people. The government functioned perfectly well with 15,000 fewer bureaucrats in 2017, and I think a starting point should be to get back to that. And if they say there's a whole lot of stuff we can't do anymore, well, maybe we need to start asking ourselves, is it really necessary to do it?
So that's a pretty ominous thing as well. Basically him saying, if they're not, if they're not going to work, let's just get rid of them altogether. I'd like to give you a chance to respond to that unmolested to start with, Jonathan, but I do have a few questions about what he said as well.
Sure.
Do you want to respond to anything that he said? Because that was actually directed at you.
Sure. Some of what he's saying is perfectly reasonable. We do need to be asking ourselves the question regularly, do we need to undertake these particular tasks or not? Do we, may there be better ways to do what it is that we think needs to be done? Those are perfectly reasonable questions. So I don't disagree with all that he was saying. I would part company on one or two matters. The first is he was suggesting that corrections officers are not part of the core public service. Well, actually, they are. Corrections is our largest government department. It is part of the core. So it's not to be linked with the education system or the healthcare system.
So let me ask you something on that then. If they're core, we hear Mr. Luxon talking about the core services need to reduce by 6.5%. So in your estimation, does that include corrections, therefore, because they are core?
Well, if you were applying that rule uniformly across all government departments, then yes. Wow. But of course, if you listen to what Christopher Luxon and David Seymour are saying, they're making it quite clear that there are areas where they think there needs to be some expansion in the public service / public sector. So, for example, David Seymour thinks we should be spending more money on prisons. We should have more people in prison. He thinks we should be spending more money on the Defence Force. Now, look, he's absolutely entitled to those views, and he may well be, Minister for Corrections or Minister for Defence. But we have to recognise that if we were to cut significantly in some areas of the public sector, or indeed the public service, the narrow bit, there will be consequences for what it is that we're able to do.
I specifically want to get your opinion. I mean, you don't know, lucky for you, lucky for most of us, what's going on in David Seymour's head. But he seems to think, he was talking about, well, are businesses happier with extra workers at MBIE? Will principals, are they getting a better outcome with more people in the education department? But what he's not saying is, when we reduce the numbers, business will operate better. When we reduce the numbers, principals will be happier. So it's kind of this false equivalency that they're not saying they're happy, therefore I must get rid of these people, because maybe this euphoric state of 2017, all principals were happy and all businesses, they were able to run efficiently. But now that there's new public servants, all of a sudden they're struggling to run their businesses, and the principals aren't telling me they're happy. I mean, to me, that feels again like another political narrative, another bait and switch, because he's not saying to us, when we remove these people, we'll be back in that Shangri-La and everything will be wonderful again.
Yes. Well, I mean, a really critical issue here, Pat, is how do we assess performance?
Yeah.
And again, I go back to the question, what is it that we're trying to achieve? Is it making principals happy? Is that an objective? I wouldn't have thought that was a primary objective of our education system. Is making business people happy? Is that a primary objective of the public service or the public sector? I rather doubt it. David Seymour is entitled to his view that these are important ways of assessing the quality of government, but I would beg to differ with him. I think there are rather more important and objective ways of assessing outcomes. As far as business is concerned, there are things that governments do that will necessarily make businesses unhappy from time to time.
Yeah.
They have to pay taxes. They have to conform with various health and safety regulations. They have to conform with various environmental regulations. Many business people find that really frustrating, and I can understand that. If I was running a business, I'm sure I would feel the same. But I wouldn't be judging the success of the government's regulatory machinery on the basis of whether people are happy or unhappy. That's just ridiculous. I'm sorry.
I'd like to play one more piece of audio for you. It's only about 60 seconds, but it's something we've been talking about here in BHN for the whole election cycle and before. And it's this idea of telling us we're going to have a government run like a business. Now, I have huge concerns with that, but let me play you the 60 seconds or so here where in this morning's interview, David Seymour spoke about, what's going to happen when we start running the country like a business. As a bit of a preface to what's going to be said in just a second.
Chief executives of government departments should have a contract with the minister and key performance indicators and performance pay. So if you're the chief of the Ministry of Social Development, you're responsible for giving out about $30 billion in pensions and benefits. We want to see people getting off benefits into work and staying in work. But if you, the ministry, the chief executive of MSD, you don't actually get paid more in return for getting people off work, off benefits into work. You don't really get paid less if more people are on benefits for longer, which is what's happened. Now, we've said that person should have a really clear contract, and just like the chief executive of any company on the NZX 50 should get paid more if they perform and maybe fired if they don't. Jonathan Boston is in the paper this morning saying, if we're hiring people that respond to financial incentives, we're hiring the wrong people. They should be there for the public spiritedness of serving the nation and the government and the community. Well, it all sounds like great stuff, but that's not how business works. And it's not how human nature works, and it hasn't worked for the taxpayer either.
It's not how business works, but we've been banging our heads against the wall saying running a country is not a business. So I agree that's not how business works, but a country is not a business. And this idea of monetizing outcomes. Now, my father was involved in the insurance company. I'm not saying he was dodgy, but the insurance company's been proven, especially in America, to be very dodgy for a long time, that if they can deny your claim, the person can get money from it. So it's monetized to have a negative outcome for the people. If what they're saying is that the head of wins is going to have a better outcome if fewer people are getting benefits, that's a monetizable way that the customer could end up suffering significant harm if the wrong person was in that position. And I'm just really concerned that if you were to run a country like it was a business, for example, you'd get rid of all the libraries. They're not profitable. You'd start charging for things like police, if you're going to the nth degree of neoliberalism. But I don't quite understand. You've said it very clearly. He repeated what you were saying about, it's a service. We're providing a service. Services don't in turn necessarily provide a profit. They provide a service first. Is it a genuine concern? And what are we going to need to look out for to not allow the country to start being run like a business? Or is that something that that we could?
Gosh. Well, Pat, this raises some very fundamental issues of an ethical and philosophical nature. The first is, of course, what is the difference between the public sector and the private sector, and indeed what should be the difference? If there are commercial
profit,
activities,
isn't it? Isn't it profit? If you're running a business, you're making a profit and giving a dividend either to yourself or to your shareholders. If it's a public service, it's a service, which means you're providing a return to the public. That's the difference, isn't it?
Well, I wish it was as simple as that, Pat. Within the sort of business community and people who think about the roles and responsibilities of the business community, there are many who would argue that businesses have roles in addition to being profitable. They include having a sense of social responsibility and environmental responsibility, for example. And moreover, there's a concern that we should be not merely incentivizing short-term profitability, but long-term profitability. And sometimes there's a conflict between the short and the long term. And there's a huge amount written about that in relation to the private sector and indeed the public sector. Now, another key point here would be to say that, of course, incentives matter, and that includes financial incentives. But when it comes to the most senior public servants, and that's what I was talking about, to which David Seymour was responding, when it comes to the most senior public servants, it's actually, first of all, difficult to assess performance in a rigorous and quantitative way. And secondly, if I'm making an appointment of a departmental chief executive, I want that person to be working 24/7 for the benefit of the nation, my government, and the people that that department is there to serve, regardless of whether there's a financial incentive or not. In other words, I want that person working really well, not because they're going to get some additional increment to their salary if they appear to have done really well according to some specific performance criteria that someone's come up with,
Yeah.
but because they have a wholehearted desire to serve the public well, to serve the government well, and so forth. So the next thing to say is there's absolutely no evidence that I'm aware of that would indicate that senior public servants actually perform better when there is performance-based remuneration. If someone can provide some really robust evidence on that, to the contrary, I'd be very keen to see it. And then, you know, there's a downside to performance-based remuneration for the very senior public servants, and that is this: we want people in that senior role to be providing the best possible advice to ministers without fear or favour. Mm-hmm. To be able to tell ministers point blank, Minister, I think you're wrong about that. If you really want to do this, then this would be a better way of doing it than what you're suggesting, and so on. If chief executives think that their pay might be at stake if they tell the truth to their minister, then a very fundamental constitutional convention, namely that these people should provide free and frank advice, risks being undermined. And I think that would be very, very unfortunate.
Really good point to finish on. Thank you very much, Emeritus Professor from Victoria University, Jonathan Boston. Jonathan, thanks so much for joining us this evening.
My pleasure, Pat. Happy to talk again sometime. I'm sure these issues won't go away.